I started working on the railroad in the summer of 1974. I had some debts from building my cabin. I owed money to a friend I'd borrowed money from, and actually, I borrowed money from his wife. Then his wife had divorced him. She'd given up alcohol and cigarettes and my friend all at once. It was a sort of marital trifecta for her. She said to him, "You know that debt, you know that $3,000 Richard borrowed from me when we left those blank checks, when we were trying to save our marriage?" "Yeah," he said. "Didn't work out so well, did it?" He meant saving the marriage, I suppose. He might have meant getting the $3,000 back from me, but I think he was thinking about his marriage. He was in shock still. She said, "Well, that $3,000 debt I will cede to you in our divorce settlement. He can pay you that money." Clearly, she had no faith I was going to pay anyone. I needed a job where I could save some money and pay back this money that I owed. That was becoming more important to me the more I heard I was incapable of paying it back. And the railroad would be a good job for that. But the main reason I wanted to work on the railroad was that I had heard through a friend who had tipped me off that the Chicago Northwestern, the C&NW, was hiring. From this same friend, I had heard that the railroad was the best line of work to work at for getting time off from work. It was a kind of paradox. It was the best sort of job for non-workers, such as myself, who wanted to go off to a cabin in the woods and write a novel. I wanted to be able to save up, then go off and write. He said, "That will not be a problem on the railroad. This is a perfect job for you. Once you've done your probationary period and you've really got the job, it's a union job. They won't fire you. You've got the job, then you can get all the time off you want, come back and work when you need to, and go and write. Perfect." "Perfect," says I. Except, as it turned out, it wasn't perfect. It would have been perfect 80 or 90 years earlier. There had been a time before unions, before air brake systems in trains, before diesels came in, long before diesels came in, when you could be a boomer and work on the railroad. These guys were called boomers. They'd go off to the Pacific Northwest and work in the timber regions, maybe in the summertime, when there was lots of business there. For the grain rush in the Midwest, where we were, they'd come and work in the fall. For all I knew, maybe in the wintertime, they'd go down south and work around oil refineries. They could work when they wanted to if they were trained as switchmen and brakemen. And then they could take time off, go ride the rails if they wanted to, do anything. That was back around 1900. But this is 1975. I had my cabin in the woods. It was almost completely fixed up to my satisfaction. I had the novel in my head that I wanted to write. I just didn't have the time. I had the money in the bank. So I'd been on the railroad an entire year. I'd been through one grain rush when we could not get any time off as brakemen. We were on the extra board. We were called extra men. We filled in for the older guys who could hold steady runs. If they had to go off to the doctor, or if they got sick or got injured or something, lost a finger, coupling up two cars, needed time to recover, we could fill in for them. And we did. We were on call on this extra board around the clock. They gave us 8 hours of rest between assignments. So it was possible during the grain rush, say, for us to work 8 days in a week. And we often did. It was just the opposite of the way this friend who worked on the BN, the Burlington Northern, described it to me. It wasn't as if you could get all the time off you wanted. You couldn't get any time off. You had to make up these fantastical stories about various grandmothers who died, funerals to go to, people with cancer in the family, one crisis after another. You had to be imaginative to get any time off. It was lucky for us that they didn't count our grandparents, because I knew guys who'd had way more than 4 grandparents die. But of course, in the modern age, you could have any number of grandparents, I suppose. Anyway, in the fall of 75, I was in love with a woman, Molly, in Minneapolis. She knew I was going away to write if I could get time off. She was in love with me too. That's what she said. When it became clear I wasn't going to be able to get time off to go write, I decided I was going to have to quit the railroad, the C&NW. Cheap and nothing wasted. Chicago and nowhere. I was going to go to nowhere to write my book out in the woods. In fact, the C&NW went not so far from my woods. You could hear its whistle off in the distance some nights. But before I quit in the fall of 1975, I had to get one health concern cleared up. I'd been having some troubling and quite painful headaches. I made an appointment with a neurologist in Minneapolis that I'd heard had a good reputation, and I went to see him, described my symptoms. He was a bit intimidating, this doctor. He wasn't a big man. He had a small frame, but he looked very solid and stocky and muscled. He looked like a Marine to me. I wasn't sure he'd be sympathetic to my symptoms at all. I don't recall his name. His first name was Glenn. I don't recall his last name. Neurologist. He hooked me up to all these wires and did numerous tests on me. They didn't show that anything serious was wrong with me. But, he said, one blood test he had given me did come back telling him that I had mononucleosis. This baffled me because I'd had mononucleosis in college, my first year in college. And I'd been told that you could only get mono once in your life. Not true, evidently. A lot of things you get told in life aren't true. That you can only get mono once and that the railroad is the best line of work for not working. So I had mono again. He said, what you need is rest. I said, well, that's what I want, is rest. I was just about to quit the railroad to get plenty of rest. He said, you won't have to quit now. I can write you a note, and you can get some time off, and then you can go back to work on the railroad. How much time? I said. 6 weeks? I was probing, hoping for the most. I knew that probably the most I could get off for mono was 2 or 3 weeks. He said, is that how much time you want off? He seemed kinder now than I had thought before, more sympathetic. I was surprised. Again, I'd misjudged someone based on their looks. What do you want to do with your time off? He asked. Well, doctor, what I want to do is I want to go away to this cabin I built in the woods and write a novel. I've got these kerosene lamps in the cabin. They're the same sort of lamps we have on the railroad. I didn't steal them from the railroad, but every now and then I can get a few spare parts from the caboose. If I need this mantle thing that you set in. Yeah, I know what those are, he said. He had some experience with kerosene lamps. So I've got this cabin fixed up. I've got everything but the free time to spend writing there. He said, well, you can have some free time now. How much do you want? I said, well, 3 months? He said, I could write you a note for that. Sure. And so he did. He wrote me out a note to the railroad saying I was not allowed to go back to work for a full 3 months because I had this serious condition of mononucleosis. So I had all of October, November, and December, a little bit into January, free. I'd go up there to my cabin. Molly would come visit me and express her love for me there in the woods. We'd have an idyllic time together every now and then. She was determined to stay in Minneapolis and work because since her split up with her husband, she had been independent for the first time in her life. She didn't want to be dependent on me in the woods. I understood this. I got lots of good long nights of sleep. I had a kitten that I took with me up to the woods, a kitten that had no name but was very cute, and I watched it chasing mice and devouring them. A kitten kills a mouse and eats it instantaneously, doesn't play with it, doesn't torment it. That's a cat once it gets older. Kittens are not so nasty and mean as older cats. At least this one wasn't. This cat with no name, this kitten. I cut up sections of wood with my chainsaw. I had a small chainsaw and split the wood. I had one stove that I think was called an Atlanta stove, a copy of an Ashley, which was the high-end version of the same thing. You could fill it with big chunks of wood once you had the fire going and damp it down tight, and it would burn most of the night, keep the cabin warm. And then over on the other side of my tiny cabin, I had a cook stove. I'd feed it with kindling and cook on that. It had 4 little round plates. I was all set. Things were good. I savored the smell of wood smoke, savored the silence of the woods. I enjoyed the first snow falling, watched it fall with a sense of security and soothing peacefulness that came with knowing that I had nice snowshoes to make it out on if it snowed a lot. I had a girlfriend who was coming to visit because she loved me. I had this kitten for companionship in the meantime. I had my guitar I could play little songs on. I even had a small record player that I'd had in college as a joke, but now it was serious because I had no electricity at the cabin. And on this record player that ran from flashlight batteries, I could play LP records. This one friend had had a job at a radio studio. The studio had closed down. They had all these records to get rid of. So I had all the Loretta Lynn I could stand, Conway Twitty, didn't have to listen to current events. I would buy the Chicago Tribune in Wakefield, the local town. Things were calmer once Nixon was gone. There wasn't much news to keep track of. I'd get a postcard in the mail every now and then from Molly in Minneapolis. But she had warned me she wasn't much of a correspondent, and that was accurate. Just about all they said was how very much she loved me, and how she looked forward to seeing me and holding me. But she didn't come visit. Finally she did in early November, but she didn't come alone. There were buses. She could have come by herself, but she didn't. And I wondered about that. And yet I was happy trying to plot out my novel in my mind, cutting firewood, fixing up the last elements of the cabin, the ceiling, the window trim. Then when she did come to visit, Molly brought along 2 friends. She said it was because one of them had a car, and this way she had a way of getting to my area. But of course, the whole dynamic, the vibration of the cabin was entirely different with all these people there. They brought several bottles of booze with them, and we mixed these strong drinks, which I wasn't quite used to anymore. I hadn't been drinking much by myself in the woods. They brought a Monopoly set, the board game Monopoly. In fact, I think that may have been the last time in my life I ever played Monopoly, because I have a very bad association with that weekend and the game Monopoly. We drank a lot. We went to Vince Orbick's Tumbleweed Ranch and Resort and sauna. We did have a sauna there. And we had our moments of intimacy. We slept upstairs, and the other 2, Fifi and their friend, what was his name? Charles, maybe? Slept downstairs. Fifi and Charles were not an item, but it seemed to me that Fifi was watching me a little seriously, in a way that made me wonder if she had been told something by Molly. The only entertaining time, Fifi was a very humorous person, a very funny woman. And she got to talking about her mother, who was named Dorothy, but she called her mother Dordo. I thought that was a great nickname for a mother or anyone else. And I decided, I've been searching for a name for my kitten. I think I'll name her Dordo. Fifi went away. Charles went away in his car, and they took Molly with them. I was on my own in the cabin again. I got a postcard or two after that. I would go to one bar or another sometimes and go to the pay phone and call the Twin Cities, call her. More often than not, she wasn't home. She'd said she couldn't come up to my place for Thanksgiving. She had to be with her family elsewhere. But she would definitely come and visit me for Christmas. That she promised. I made her some little gifts out of wood, my wood vise with my woodworking tools. And I looked forward to Christmas. But mostly I read at home, I listened to country western tunes, and I would venture into Wakefield to look for mail and sometimes to buy the newspaper and to shoot the breeze with my friend Tippy Novak at Novak's clothing store. My only friend in the area, Tippy. We would argue politics. He was very conservative, racist, misogynist, you name it. If I brought up the topic of oral sex with him, he'd clap his hands over his ears so as not to hear anything I should sully his ears with. On the other hand, he used all the wrong dog whistle words, used what we now are forced to calling the N-word, because we can no longer read Huckleberry Finn. He used the N-word a lot. He didn't like black people. I don't think he knew any black people. I wasn't sure he'd ever met any black people, except maybe when he'd been in the army in Germany during the 50s. He must have known a few black people. But he claimed they were all monsters. And I would argue with him. All of my friends that I brought up to the woods, now none of them had been black, it's true, but there was quite a variety of them and all sorts of hairstyles and all sorts of ethnic backgrounds. He'd been friendly and generous to all of them, just as he had been with me. The women he hadn't approved of necessarily because they had seemed free and easy sexually, or so he assumed, and I would pile on details, real and imaginary, just to make him queasy in a teasing way, back and forth. He was very easygoing with me. Other people did get him upset sometimes. One day, Tippy said to me, when I showed up at his store, and I was the only other person there. Always, I was the only other person there. I said, "Why are you so upset today, Tippy? You seem really on edge." And he said, "Well, that bastard Jeff Mackey just came by. He owes me $400. I took the check, the old check. I've had it here for years. The check out of my cash drawer, and I showed it to him. And he said, "Let me see that." And he took it and he ripped it up and he laughed at me and he walked out of here. I should kill that bastard. He was so mad. He was trembling with rage. That was the only time I saw him really angry, my friend Tippy. I was glad I hadn't been there when this Jeff Mackey had come in to rip up his old check that had bounced at the bank. $400 was a lot of money to Tippy Novak. His store was failing. He had 4 children. He had a wife who seemed to me nagged him quite a bit. I didn't see her with him very often, but she had a high, querulous voice, very nasal voice, and kind of kept after him. He complained that she badgered him. Now, you could sympathize with a woman in that situation, that she might be restive. He didn't bring in much of an income. He insisted that she not work. He hated the idea of his wife going out into the workforce and bringing home income on her own. So he opposed that, didn't allow that. He was very old school, Tippy Novak. But I thought things were fairly stable at their place. I did get one sign to the contrary, though, one day when we got to talking about hunting, because I had posted signs on the border of my woods, posting my woods against hunting. No hunting in these woods. Not a popular thing to do up there. But I'd done it. I mean, I was living there. I didn't want bullets flying around where my cabin was when I was there. It seemed legitimate to me, and I did it. Tippy said, I'm not much of a hunter myself. My father, also named John, I didn't even know Tippy's name was John. Big John, they called him. No one would call me Big John, and that was a fact. Tippy was not a big guy, and he did not exude a big persona. He was always self-deprecating. He hunched down and he talked about what a failure he was. He was smaller even than he was because of the way he referred to himself. But his father, who might have been the same size, was Big John Novak, and he was a great hunter, especially a great rabbit hunter. He'd had dogs, he trained them well, go out into the marsh in the wintertime. They would hunt rabbits, and he would bring back lots of rabbits. Well, Tippy had tried to be a rabbit hunter, but he wasn't successful at training dogs. They'd get out into the marsh, and the dog wouldn't scare up the rabbits the way it was supposed to. Tippy told me one day about a time he had gone rabbit hunting with his oldest son and this dog Tippy, had given to his son. And the dog hadn't behaved right. Like all the dogs in his past that Tippy had trained, this dog was a failure at hunting rabbits, he said. Tippy wasn't in a good mood anyway that day. And at one point, when the dog made some particularly bad error in terms of rabbit hunting, Tippy had impulsively turned toward it and fired his shotgun at it, killed it, in front of his son, whose dog it was. He told me this. I listened. I said, did that really happen? Tippy. Yes, it did. It's a terrible thing, but it really happened. I shot his dog right in front of him. I'm a terrible person. I said, Tippy, you've never been terrible to me. You've been nothing but generous to me, always. When I buy something from you, I have to talk you up in price because you're so generous. I find it hard to believe you would have done something like that to your kid. Well, I didn't shoot him, I shot his dog. But yeah, it wasn't good. I shouldn't have been allowed to have children. But these things happen. And so that was one way I passed the time, talking with Tippy. He liked to tell me about all the heinous crimes that had been committed out in the woods thereabouts, in the area around Wakefield, around Marinisco, the next town down Highway 2. My cabin was located between these two towns on an old county road called the Dunham Road because it linked up Wakefield and Marinisco. It was the old former highway from the old days. He said, oh, people who live on Dunham Road, they're a zany bunch. They're lunatics, some of them. Husband and wives, they don't get along. You gotta hide the knives when they're fighting. You never know when the blood is going to flow out there. You should really have a gun living out there yourself. To which I said, well, Tippy, I don't. I don't really believe in people having guns up the patoot, like so many seem to in this country. I'm perfectly happy living in the woods without a gun. If I had a gun, the biggest danger I would be to myself, with the gun going off in my face, because I did the wrong thing with it. I'm better off in a place without electricity even, so I don't give myself a bad jolt of a shock doing something stupid with that. Guns I don't need. He said, there are bears out in those woods. What if a bear comes after you? I said, well, I'll just climb a tree then, won't I, Tippy? I don't know. I haven't seen any bears yet. So we would talk. He would tell me about horrific crimes that had happened back in the old days, but it seemed very mild compared to the news you would hear on the radio living in the Twin Cities. The news from Vietnam was not good in those days. I heard far more horrific things about napalm and Agent Orange and all the rest that seemed far more bothersome to me than any tale Tippy remembered or might make up to scare me. So everything was good in the woods. My life was good, with one notable possible exception. I didn't hear from Minneapolis. I didn't get any mail from there now, and when I called, I very seldom got through to her. When I did get a postcard, it said she wasn't sure she was coming for Christmas, after all. She would see. And that's all I heard. I called, she didn't answer. Meantime, I was trying to figure out when I would get started on this novel. It's a little hard, for me anyway, to get started on a novel when psychologically I'm on pins and needles about some person I love. And I'm starting to anticipate a sense of rejection even before it hits. That's a hard time to begin a novel. You need to feel strong and self-assured in certain ways when you begin a novel, and I wasn't feeling that way entirely. I'd go skiing sometimes at the Indian Head ski mountain, which was just beyond Wakefield. I had a station wagon in those days because I could haul stuff around in that, and it started very reliably. It was an old station wagon I'd bought for $200. I kept some skis and cheap ski boots in the back. I didn't have to carry them out from the cabin. If I went to check my mail in Wakefield, I could just drive another 5 or 10 minutes and I'd be at Indian Head on a weekday. I could practically have the mountain to myself. Ski for a couple of hours and then go home. That was great. But I didn't hear from Minneapolis. And the only person I told about my misgivings was Tippy. He said to me when I told him this, he said, she won't come. She's having a high time in the big city. She's tasted that high life now. She doesn't want to come to the woods, be peaceful with you. She won't come. You got to be used to this idea. I didn't trust her from the beginning, he said. But there were lots of women he hadn't trusted from the beginning. I was starting to learn this. So on Christmas Day, I got up, I dressed, I fed the fire. I looked at this small tree I'd put in place in the corner of the small room of the cabin with a few homemade decorations on it. I looked at it wistfully. There were some presents under it. They weren't for me. I held my cat in my lap. Dordo. Scratched Dordo behind her ears. She purred. She was reliable. She was there with me. And then there came a knocking at the door. I hadn't heard anyone arriving, but you wouldn't on the soft snow. There was a way in. You could come without snowshoes because I had gone in and out on the same trail on my snowshoes so many times I had packed it down about the width of a sidewalk so people could walk in without any effort, just wearing boots. even with the huge amount of snow we got there. But if they stepped one step off the walkway, they'd be up to their chest in snow. When I heard this knock on the door, I thought, oh, don't get hopeful. If it had been Molly, she would have just walked in. She wouldn't have knocked. That's formal for her. But I went to the door and I opened it, and there stood Tippy outside. He had never come to visit me on his own. He'd been back to my cabin with me a time or two for a drink, and he'd get wild when he had a drink, so I didn't encourage that much. But a couple of times he'd come back with me. This time it was morning. It was Christmas Day. He looked shyly across at me from the entrance and he said, you know, I was thinking this is Christmas and I was picturing you by yourself out here in the woods. And I knew she wouldn't show up today. And I thought, you should come spend Christmas with me and my family. Come spend time in Wakefield. We'll go riding on our snowmobile. The kids can show you the presents they got for Christmas. It'll take your mind off things. Come on. And so I went with him. Left the kitten to fend for herself. She'd been fine other times when I'd gone away for a few hours. Left the little Christmas tree with its pitiful presents underneath. I didn't go into Wakefield in Tippy's car with him. Then he'd have to drive me back out later. I drove my car after him. I was very sad, but I was grateful to him for thinking of me. I ate with his family, good Christmas dinner. His wife didn't nag him too severely that day. She got after some of the kids a bit. Her voice got on my nerves. Karen was her name. Tippy said her face was marked by the fact that she came from Finnish extraction. She was a Finn. He said, you know, back in the boom times when there were 10,000 people in Wakefield, there were different neighborhoods. Not like now, but there was a Finn neighborhood, a Polish neighborhood where I grew up. And we all called the Finn neighborhood, we called it Chinatown, because they looked like chinks. Tippy, I said, that's terrible. What are you saying? He said, well, look at their eyes sometime. Look at Karen's eyes sometime. She's got high cheekbones, like Mongolian. A chink. He was trying to get under my skin. I ignored it. Chinatown. The way he talked. But he was good to me. He thought of me on Christmas Day. He came out to my cabin. He went way out of his way, came out to my cabin and got me. Maybe he wanted to get away from his family for a while himself. That thought didn't occur to me until much later. But I don't think that was it. I think it was a genuine fraternal human interest that compelled him to go out and bring me back to spend Christmas Day with his family. We rode on his ski-mobile, his snowmobile. I rode once. That was the only time I've ever ridden on a snowmobile. And it wasn't a very pleasurable sensation because it smelled so bad of fuel and it was terribly noisy. I hadn't thought of that. I didn't mind the sound of a two-cycle engine when I was running my chainsaw to cut wood. But if I was trying to have fun, I much preferred the sleek, sweet sound of skis going down a hillside and the peacefulness of that to the whining roar of this snowmobile. It did go fast. It seemed to be going very fast. But I went fast skiing too. After Christmas, it took me a while, but I did get going on that novel. I was just starting in on it when my 3 months elapsed with the railroad, my time off, my sick leave. And it had been a paid sick leave, funny enough, because I'd had mononucleosis. But I hadn't finished my novel. I'd barely gotten started with it. So I went back to Minneapolis. I saw Molly, and that was not a happy experience. All it did was certify what I'd been suspecting all along. It was painful. But I also went back to the doctor, Dr. Glenn so-and-so, the neurologist. He said, "How's the novel going?" And I said, "Doctor, I've barely got going on it, but I can see my way now. Is there any possibility I could get another 3 months off? And this time, if you could phrase it in such a way, you could tell the railroad that I'm not entitled to sick pay anymore, but I still need the time off to rest for another 3 months. Could you phrase it somehow like that?" "Of course I could," he said. "I'd be pleased to help you." And he looked nothing like a Marine. He didn't look stern. He didn't look severe. He looked nothing but friendly as he was saying this. I said, "Why are you being so good to me? Why are you helping me out so much?" And he said, "It's because I always wanted to do what you're doing now, but I never had the nerve to push through for it. I never asserted myself to go out into the woods and really do something creative the way you are. I admire that so much that I want to do everything I can to encourage you." So he was generous with me too. I was lucky in my friends. And in the spring, when the 6 months had elapsed, I had finished my first draft of the novel, and I went back to being a brakeman on the railroad. It wasn't a grain rush, but it was busy, and they were still under hiring on the Chicago and Northwestern. They still kept us busy all the time, but I didn't drink as much anymore. I was too sad from this broken up romance, and I didn't smoke cigarettes very much anymore. I worked, and I worked, and I saved money, and at some point in the future, I would write another novel in my cabin in the woods. Or maybe I wouldn't. Maybe I'd go somewhere else.